Hey, today we've got the LOMO compact automatic camera introduced in Russia in 1984. Does it live up to the hype? Da or nyet? Stick around for a completely biased and unobjective view of the LOMO LC-A. Coming right up. So, the first version of this camera did come out in 1984, but there have actually been 3 runs of this particular camera. The first one lasted for about a decade until they ceased production, and then a couple of young Austrians who went on to form the Lomographic Society International persuaded the Lomo people to reopen the factory and start producing these models again. I got my LCA in 1999 during this second run, and then in 2006 the Lomography people actually released the LCA Plus, a new version of the LCA that added a couple features like multiple exposures and the ability to set higher ISO ratings too. You can still buy these cameras today, although the new ones, the current model, is produced in China, not in Russia. Let's take a closer look at the camera and check out some of the specs. Alright, here it is. At the top you can see this little cartoon character. That's one of the ways you can tell this is from the second production run of this camera, because they do have that little caricature, that little cartoon guy up there. You can also see the designation of Minitar 1 right in the middle there. That is the famous Russian lens that's on this thing. And a couple of things it's famous for are the contrast that it gives, and really nice saturated images with a lot of punch if you're using color film, especially, of course. And it gives a very nice vignette too, very organic vignetting. That's one of the complaints of the Diana Instant Square, is that the vignetting on that is not very natural and just kind of contrived, kind of fake looking. You don't get that fake look at all. It's a very organic look, very natural feel to the vignetting on the LOMO LC-A. You can see one of the designations on this lens is, again, it's 32mm, so nice focal length, and it does have a maximum aperture of f2.8. You can see the apertures listed on the side here. Most people would just keep this in A at the bottom for automatic. It does have apertures ranging from f2.8 up to 16, but when you switch these though, it fixes the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second, which is good for flash sync, but that's really about it. So I think it's best practice just to keep it in A for automatic, and it works very well in that mode. The shutter speeds do range from 1/500th of a second all the way up to 2 minutes. So a lot of people really like to use this for a long exposure up to 2 minutes. One note about that is you do want to keep holding in on the shutter release here. If you let go, it will actually close the shutter. So if you're doing those long exposures, keep your finger on the button. Over here, you can see the different focus range here. This is a zone focus camera. And down at the bottom here, we have infinity. And then next is 3 meters, then 1.5 meters, and 0.8 meters. I do not natively think in meters, so I kind of think in feet, so I just use this as infinity. 3 meters are around to about 10 feet, and 1.5 is roughly about 5 feet, and then 0.8 meters is close enough to 3 feet to get me by. And that works pretty well. The scheme on this, again, you can see infinity is at the bottom. This got me a little bit of trouble when I got my Olympus XA2 because the focus distances are opposite on that camera, so on my first roll, every time I pushed it down, I think I was going to infinity, and that's actually the closest focus on that one. So my first roll, a couple shots were out of focus, of course. Right here is where you set the ASA. This does go from 25 to 400, so not a huge range, but I usually shoot 400 in this because I'm not afraid of grain, and it's always performed well for me. There's a CDS meter at the top there too. Taking a look at the inside here. And pretty standard guts here, nothing too unusual to look at. Again, no DX coating in the chamber here, that's why you have to set it manually. And here you can see some light seals that look like they're about 20 years old because they are 20 years old. Standard hot shoe on the top. I've got a cover on it right now. LCA designation there, shutter release, and frame counter. Now that we've taken a closer look at the camera, let's check out some photos. So I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, back when 126 cameras and even tiny little 110 cameras were popular, and outside of the occasional point and shoot or maybe disposable camera, the LCA here was really my first 35mm camera. It was kind of my gateway camera into 35mm photography, and I think that's one of the reasons I have a lot of fondness for it still to this day. It's kind of like your first love. You always remember your first love, and that's how I feel about this LCA. And another thing was I was kind of intimidated at the time of photography and almost kind of scared of it, but then the 10 rules of lomography kind of helped me along, and you've probably heard of those before. Something you can't take too seriously because rule number 10 is that there are no rules. But some of the rules were things like don't think, be fast, shoot from the hip. So again, for me, it just made photography in general a lot more approachable and a lot more accessible. And this really was my main shooter up until probably about 2009, when my boss gave me his wife's old Olympus OM2N 35mm SLR, and that was really my first SLR. And so I started using that more and just kind of expanded into different genres, different cameras too. But this camera, again, since I used it very almost exclusively for about 10 years, saw me through a lot of things. And again, I think that's another reason why it will always have a special place in my heart. Back then, it helped me deal with the grief of losing my mom. It helped me document the joy of meeting my wife and my kids. So it has and always will mean a lot to me. So is it the most advanced camera I've ever used? Definitely not. Is it one of my favorites? Absolutely. So a couple things about it that I do enjoy is it is a little bit quirky. So you don't know exactly what you're going to get every time. The shutter does do strange things sometimes, and you get weird light leaks and trails and all kinds of interesting things. But again, for me, that's part of the appeal. I mean, that's really, I think, why a lot of us shoot film anyway. If you want to know what you're going to get every time and want pristine, clean images, sterile images, well, you can shoot digital. And I do shoot digital sometimes, and I like that too for a different aesthetic. But for film, it's kind of fun not knowing exactly what you're going to get. And for me, this camera has just the right level of quirkiness. And if you want a little bit more control over your images and want to make sure you achieve your vision just as you conceive it, of course, you can always take a few different pictures of the same subject and kind of bracket and maybe get a better chance of getting exactly what you expect to see on film. If you like what you saw here today, give it a big thumbs up down below and subscribe to this channel. Don't forget to hit the bell so you can be notified every time I upload new content. You can find me on Instagram and Flickr as The Old Camera Guy. Thanks for watching, and as always, do some good, have some fun, and shoot some film.